The man across the lacquered table smiled like a verdict, and Lila Haddad felt her jaw clamp shut around a lie she hadn't meant to tell. He leaned back, cufflinks catching the low light, and pronounced the name of an international charitable trust as though naming angels. Around him, laughter folded into the hush of men who calculated borders and futures between courses. Lila's hands held a tray, 3 glasses of limoncello, a decanter of deep red, and for one heart-stopping second she saw, not the shimmering promise on the paper they passed, but the real thing, a ledger inked with numbers that could unmake people, 200 million folded into a clean story that would let money vanish into the thin air of legalese. Her train of thought ended where grief always began. Her brother's face, the last time she'd seen him in a doorway, and how someone like them could be erased with a signature. The hum of the restaurant narrowed. She heard herself respond before she recognized the voice. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. "That's false," she said in perfect Arabic, the syllables a clean blade. The table stopped being a table. Utter silence cut through the murmur like glass. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Alessandro Moretti's smile thinned into something dangerous, not the poised danger of a man used to being obeyed, but the startled edge of someone surprised to be contradicted. In a tongue he understood only by reputation. Across from him, a man in a gray suit, the broker of the night, laughed too loud and tried to translate the dismissal into a shrug. But the phrase had already done its work. The lie they'd rehearsed faltered. Lila had not planned to speak. She had rehearsed anonymity the way other people rehearsed prayers. It kept her alive here, in the belly of a downtown Sicilian-run restaurant where alliances were brokered between rounds of antipasti and decisions that altered people's lives arrived like second courses. She was 27, and her life in this city had been built on a forged name, the Arabic of a childhood in Beirut and a degree in finance she'd never used on paper. Her hands were steady from years of carrying plates, not from the careful arithmetic of laundering fortunes. And yet tonight, polishing a spoon, she'd overheard the faint arithmetic of a scam disguised as charity. The ledger they passed wrapped 200 million in a velvet glove. Her brother's disappearance fit too neatly into the kind of silence that money bought. The sound of her voice ricocheted. Someone at the head of the table asked her in Italian where she was from. She felt every eye on her then, as if the room had collectively decided she could be either witness or weapon. Lila kept her face neutral. "Beirut," she said, which was both true and false. She had been born there, yes. That was the one honest tether she allowed herself. But Beirut had been a memory, a map she kept folded small, not the passport of her present. The man in gray, who smelled faintly of expensive tobacco and even more expensive lies, said something about languages being useful. He smiled at her the way men smiled at useful things. Alessandro watched the exchange, not the man in gray. In him, Lila saw the slow folding of power on a man shaped by violence and loyalty. 39, with the kind of hands that had learned to give orders and accept falls. He had the polished menace of heritage, a family name that bent law and gunfire into service, a ledger of favors that made people owe him their mornings and hide their evenings in bribes. Alessandro watched the exchange, not the man in gray. In him, Lila saw the slow folding of power on a man shaped by violence and loyalty. 39, with the kind of hands that had learned to give orders and accept falls. He had the polished menace of heritage, a family name that bent law and gunfire into service, a ledger of favors that made people owe him their mornings and hide their evenings in bribes. People like him navigated the world as if everyone else were either a safe to be cracked or a lock to be kept. He collected depths and mercy in equal, chilling measure. Lila had served him for months, delivering platters, refilling glasses, mastering the invisible choreography that kept men like him comfortable enough to show their faces and dangerous enough to deserve vigilance. She wanted only to be invisible. That was the first promise she made to herself in this city. With a forged ID and precise pronunciation, she made smallness into survival. But survival is a brittle thing when memory gnaws at the inside. Her brother, Kareem, had vanished 2 years earlier after a wrong conversation with a man wearing a cartel's patience. The police had drawers full of shrug and paperwork. No one had followed every lead because followings cost more than they wanted to spend. Lila had learned to economize her fury into an undercurrent of careful observation. She kept names in her head the way others kept coins, counted and tucked away. When she overheard tonight's plan, a trust, a fake audit, a shell NGO, pieces clicked. Numbers became gates. Gates became the places where money walked and came out clean. And she knew the people who found gates like that invariably used them to tie up loose ends. She slid the tray toward the man in gray, and her fingers brushed his sleeve. He made a small joke about her accent. It should have been a deflection, a moment of comic lightness. Instead, it was a pivot. The man in gray, perhaps drunk on the certainty of his own script, reached for the papers as if to seal this chapter. Lila's heart beat against the hollow of her ribs. In Beirut, she had learned to read the quiet of rooms like this one, where shadows and corners held whispered transactions, where a comment could be a dagger. She fished the smallest thing she carried in her apron pocket, a battered phone with a cracked screen and a recorder app she used mostly for language notes, and slid it under the table, angled so its microphone caught the low rustle of voices. It was a dangerous, stupid move. It was also the one she could not make. Alessandro's voice softened. "You speak Arabic?" he asked, a question that could have been curiosity or threat. Lila kept her eyes on the man in gray, who was now telling a compact story to the group about how the charity would absorb funds while returning aid to their own coffers. Numbers were tossed like sprigs of parsley, garnished to distract. The ledger's ink gleamed. Lila let the recorder hum quietly. It picked up a phrase about a prosecutor who could be bought and an auditor who could be silenced. She felt her chest tighten, the old weight of helplessness rising like tidewater. Karim had once been the kind of man to walk into a room and insist on hearing the truth. He had paid for that insistence with absence. The man in gray misread her silence as acquiescence. He smiled into the amber light and slid the papers along a stream of hands until they rested near Alessandro, who tucked them into an envelope with the same care one uses to fold a pistol. Lila's mouth was dry. Her fingers found a polishing cloth and she moved it over silverware in a rhythm that belonged to someone who knew how to hide tears with small tasks. The recorder in her apron caught the muttered plans, the names, the sum that loomed like a black column. 200 million. A number that, in certain hands, rearranged lives like chess pieces. Across the room, the back door opened, and a man in a suede jacket entered late, breathing air that smelled of the port. He walked straight to Alessandro with a familiarity that made Lila's skin prickle. He was not part of the table's glitter, not exactly. His hands were calloused more by labor than leisure. He greeted Alessandro with a half-smile that suggested favors due and favors owed. Alessandro's eyes narrowed only a fraction. He nodded toward the envelope. The late man dipped his head, and the conversation stuttered into a different key. Lila recognized him by the way others in the room recognized threats. The man was more than a messenger. He was a gatekeeper. an enforcer who threaded muscle into meetings. Lila's recorder picked up the name he used in passing, Detective Romano. A soft laugh escaped from someone who revered the detective for his useful corruption. The air tasted like iron. Detectives with pockets full of favor were the underside of the city's law. They turned negligence into currency. If Detective Romano had been invited into this scaffolding, it meant the planned scaffolding reached deeper into the city's ribs than she had feared. Her nails dug crescents into the cloth in her hands. She thought of Kareem walking into a police station once, his voice steady with certainty that truth would be his ally. The memory broke something inside her. "Why did you say that?" the man in gray asked suddenly, sharp enough to be a slap. Lila felt the room tilt toward her. 3 men at the far table had risen like a tide in instinct. She mouthed a quiet answer she didn't want to give, a lie about a language lesson, a dropped word. Instead, she let the recorder keep talking for her. The device would, she hoped, be less cowardly than she felt. She could hand it over to someone she trusted, but who in this room would be that someone? Trust here was measured in exits and back pockets. Alessandro's gaze was fixed on her now, and the world narrowed to the softness of his eyes and the hardness at the edges. There was something in him that read as long-cultivated cruelty and protected tenderness entangled. A man who could not afford uncertainty, and who, perhaps, deep in some unspoken place, honored loyalty like a relic. He might, tonight, decide the fate of her small act. He might have people who would extract a price for embarrassment. Or he might, improbably, be the key to something else. Lila had not planned for improbabilities. She had planned for invisibility. The contradiction of what she had done, spoken a sentence that disrupted a staged theft of millions, and what she had become, a waitress with a memory and a recorder, compressed into a single devastating dilemma. Outside, rain began its slow arrival, making the city's lights halo. Inside, the table's laughter folded back into conversation, tentative and cautious, like a conversation after a window has been cracked. The men at the table rearranged the papers as if brushing off dust. The envelope remained, a sleeping animal, its teeth unseen. Lila gripped the polishing cloth until her knuckles whitened. For a woman used to balancing plates, balancing secrets felt like an impossible skill. The night's danger had shifted. She had drawn a line in Arabic and, in doing so, invited the room to notice a seam. She had become, without meaning to, a marker on a map of corruption. Her recorder hummed quietly under the linen, storing the voices that could make or break a life. In the corner of her mind, Kareem's last open expression, bewildered, patient, indignant, stood like a reproach. Lila realized with an almost violent clarity that remaining invisible no longer meant safety. Silence had a cost. Her dilemma unfolded. Keep the silence that had kept her alive but allowed 200 million to be laundered and perhaps another family to be erased, or speak the truth and drag herself into a war waged by men who never asked permission. Alessandro lifted the envelope as if checking its weight. The movement was small, private, and yet to Lila it signaled everything. He looked up at her, and his eyes asked a question he did not voice. Who are you to interfere? The restaurant's hum settled around them like a net. Lila's pulse echoed her decision like a drumbeat. She could hand the recorder to someone she trusted, but who could she trust in a room designed to hide sins? If she kept the evidence, she might be hunted. If she released it, she might be a sacrificial piece in a game she barely understood. When the man in gray made a joke about charity being good for the soul, Alessandro let his smile be sharp and precise, like the edge of a well-used blade. He reached into the envelope and removed a piece of paper, sliding it across the lacquer toward the man in gray. Lila watched the motion and felt a small, resolute flame kindle where fear had sat. The night had just shifted from an attempted theft to a chessboard. And for the first time since Kareem walked out of their lives, Lila felt a sick, fierce clarity. To save the memory of her brother, she might have to step into the teeth of the beast she had been hiding from all along. Her hands, which had always served plates and hidden secrets, trembled only once. Then she straightened, as if pulled into place by something older than herself, and prepared to gamble everything on a single impossible move. Lila stepped back from the table as if someone had shoved her. The recorder under her skirt hummed like a trapped insect. Men spoke around her in thinner voices now, as if the room itself had inhaled and been slowed. Alessandro's eyes did not leave her. They studied her the way one studies an unfamiliar instrument, alert, assessing, possibly intending to break it open. She finished the service as though her life depended on it, a practiced rhythm of bowls, bread, a touch of lemon on fish, but each movement was a negotiation with panic. Someone brushed past her on the way to the washroom, and his shoulder bumped the recorder. For one absurd second, she imagined the device popping free and clattering like an accusation into the foot of a table. Her hands tightened around a tray until pain woke in her palm. The man in gray laughed again, too loud for a joke. Detective Romano's presence felt like a heat pressing on the back of her neck. His shadow had settled over the conversation like gossip. When she finally cleared the table, Alessandro called her name. The sound was soft in a room that had recently contained a small earthquake. Lila froze beside the pass, the kitchen's heat and scent of simmering tomatoes wrapping around her like a blanket she couldn't shrug off. He was up now, moving through the restaurant with a kind of authority that made the staff part like reeds. The cooks looked up and then away. The waiters kept to the margins, their faces schooled into neutrality. "Lila," Alessandro said, quietly, close enough that she could smell the citrus of the limoncello still on his breath. He did not speak Arabic to her. He didn't need to. His voice carried the same controlled danger as his smile had moments before. "In my courtyard," he added. It was a command framed as an invitation. Her first thought was to refuse. Her second, more honest one, was that refusal was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. If she ran, if she vanished into anonymity again, the men at the table would keep the envelope and the ledger and the legal smokescreen. Kareem's absence would remain a ghost in an empty apartment. But if she stayed, she risked exposure in a network of men who had more to lose than she could imagine. She wiped her hands on the apron with shaking fingers and followed him out a side door that smelled of oil and night air. They walked down a narrow alleyway between the restaurant and the building behind it, the city's distant sirens a muffled lullaby. The courtyard was a rectangle of marble and a rusting fountain, lit by a single lantern that made Alessandro's face a chiaroscuro, almost benevolent, almost terrible. He leaned against the fountain's carved lip and watched her. For a moment, they were simply two people in the hush of a city that did not like being interrupted. Then he asked, "Why did you say it was false?" The question was simple. The implication was not. Lila thought of the recorder in her pocket like a live wire. She thought of Kareem's last face. Her tongue felt thick with everything she had left unsaid. She could have lied. She could have said she was a purist, that truth was a habit. Instead, she said, "Because sometimes truth is a door that leads to people who won't let one of their own disappear." Alessandro's reaction was a curious thing, a small exhale, as if the answer had surprised him into softness. "You think I let people disappear?" His voice tightened around the word disappear, like someone touching a bruise. "No." Lila's reply was quick and honest. "I think you keep people safe in ways that have cost others. I used to believe in doors. Now I am not sure which ones let people out and which ones lock them in." She pictured Kareem, younger and sure of rightness, pushing himself forward into a place he'd thought was clean. That naivete had been the last thing she had seen. They stood in silence. The fountain's water made a faint, steady sound, as if the city itself were breathing. Alessandra watched her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Half judgment, half fascination, and something like a tired curiosity. "If you have evidence," he said at last, "there are ways we handle evidence here." The tilt of his voice suggested threats folded into offers, protection in exchange for utility. Lila's chest constricted. This was the code of their world, favors counted in blood and in silence. She had come here hoping to avoid such currencies. Now she found herself standing in front of a man who priced safety. "I have a recording," she admitted, and the confession felt like stepping off a ledge. "Of the plan, names, 200 million. Detective Romano is involved. There are auditors. There are, or were, people who can prove connections between payoffs and disappearances." Alessandro's hands were still in his pockets. He looked at her as if he were measuring the weight of a scale. "Give it to me," he said, "or tell me where it is." She thought of the men at the table, the way their laughter had folded into a hush. She thought of the battered phone under her skirt. "I won't give it to you to bury," she said. The words came faster than she meant them to. "This isn't about favors. It's about whether people like my brother can keep breathing. If you take it, if you bury it, I will lose him again." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, almost private. "Do you imagine there is a world in which I bury people for sport?" He, of all men, knew what burying looked like. He kept his enemies in precise coffins. "I decide what to bury for the people I call my own," he said. "I can protect you. I can get you an audience that might listen in a way the police do not. But you will owe me something if I involve myself." Lila's first instinct was to say no. Owing Alessandro Murray was like agreeing to carry fire, warm, necessary, and inevitably burning. But the night had already stripped away most of her options. The recorder hummed in its recessed pocket like a heart beating behind a rib cage. "What would you want?" she asked. He smiled then, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Truth, in a place that knows how to carry it," he said. "Names. Proof beyond a doubt. I do not like being embarrassed in front of my table. If this is a scam, I will break the neck of the man who sold it to me. If it is truth, we will need allies who are not on any payroll you and I know." His last words were spoken with a hint of reluctance, as if naming them cost him more than he expected. "Legit allies?" Lila's laugh was short, disbelief fraying at the corners. "The legal ones? The police?" "A few honest ones exist. In the cracks. And there are judges with a conscience, stubborn and useless until they are fed the right proof. You do know the difference between ledgers and laundering, yes? You said you had a degree in finance. That wasn't a lie." Her stomach dropped. She had not told him anything about her education. Panic and curiosity collided in her chest. She had to choose how much she'd show, how much she would risk. "I can read numbers," she said instead. "I know how to trace them. I can follow the money." He studied her like a new problem. For the first time, he said something about his past that didn't bear the sharp angle of command. His voice softened, and the city seemed to lean in. "I failed once," he murmured, like a confession tucked into the dark. "When I was younger, there was a boy in our neighborhood. He trusted a man who said he could help. I didn't protect him. I thought my rules would be enough, that the world's balances would correct themselves. They didn't. The boy—" He stopped. If his voice had been a blade, it would have dulled to a whisper. Lila felt it, a fissure in the armor around him, a small, useless human truth. "I'm sorry," she said. Because when two people lived by regret and blood, apologies were a currency of their own. He nodded, the expression in his eyes unreadable. You will work with me. We will be careful. We will not go to the police without a plan. And you will not go to anyone else without telling me first. The conditions were a net cast with practiced hands. Lila paused, feeling the bind of his terms sprawl across her like an unseen rope. You want my silence first, she said. Then you'll give me help second. The statement wasn't an accusation so much as an arithmetic of survival. I want the recording, he said simply. I want to know who thinks they can outplay me. And I want to know if your brother's disappearance is part of what I'm looking at. Her breath hitched. You could throw him into the mix, she asked. She could hardly imagine letting Alessandro touch the raw edges of Karim's memory. He met her eyes. For a breath, there was no boss and no waitress, only two tired, dangerous people. I owe my people safety, he said. If this ledger reaches beyond my kitchen, I owe the city something else. If Karim's disappearance ties into this, then until I see it for myself, I will not promise you anything more than my interest. Lila counted the cost of the interest. It could mean leverage, a weapon she had never wielded. It could mean being used in a game she could not oversee. But it could also mean the difference between memory and movement, between a brother she could mourn and a brother she might find. She thought of handing him the phone there in the fountain's lantern, of shrinking her world down to a device that could be transferred like contraband. She imagined Detective Romano's face when he learned his name, spoke in audio, of the ledger opening like a maw. She also imagined the men in the restaurant deciding that a girl who spoke Arabic was a loose thread to be trimmed. All right, she said finally, the word coming out low and raw. But on two conditions. One, you don't bury it. If you use it to bring names into daylight. Two, I get access. Numbers, files, anything, and I trace them. I will not be a puppet. He considered her like an artisan weighing the grain for a recipe. You will not be my puppet, he promised. You will be my partner, and if you cross me— You mean if I betray you, she finished, meeting his look. Trust is not simple for me. He smiled then, something almost like approval. Nor for me, he said. But perhaps two people with broken trust can make a path wide enough for truth. They shook on it, a simple press of palms in the fountain's gloom. It was not a vow sanctified by anything but need, and yet it felt dangerous enough to be sacred. When they separated, the weight of the night returned like a coastal tide. Lila pocketed the recorder. The decision had birthed both relief and dread. She thought of Karim like a small, stubborn flame. For the first time since he had disappeared, the flame felt like it might be coaxed into light rather than smothered. They worked too quickly after that, a choreography of shadow and urgency. Alessandro arranged a driver, a quiet man with a face like river rock, to take Lila to the safe house he used for business that could not be kept inside the restaurant's back rooms. They spoke in clipped sentences about what she had heard, about witnesses, about auditors who might be swayed. He gave names. Not many, but enough that Lila felt the threads of the scam unspool slightly. An offshore firm registered in Malta, an auditor with ties to the prosecutor's office, a shell company with a director who painted his life in philanthropy and dressed it in lawyers. Every name lit a new piece of the map. They did not go to the police. They could not. A web with Detective Romano inside meant certain corruption, and the police had pockets as deep and as leaky as anyone's. They decided instead to find an honest judge, someone Alessandro knew of through a cousin who ran a bakery and owed him a debt. The idea seemed absurd, to go to the city's hidden justice with the kind of truth that could undo powerful men. But it was the only path that did not involve a direct showdown. If they could secure a warrant, a public hearing, a judge who would not blink at money, then the ledger could be exposed in a legal light that would force the corrupt to act. On the ride to the safe house, Lila sat beside Alessandro, the recorder heavy in her pocket, like a seed ready to sprout. Rain had begun to smear the city's lights into watercolor. Outside the car window, buildings blurred into the smeared city life. He watched his profile in the dark glass, jaw set like granite. "Why help me?" she asked, not quite the same as asking why he had stopped her in the restaurant, but close. "Because," he said slowly, "sometimes the cost of keeping my people safe means I have to be wrong about who deserves to live free of fear." He turned to look at her fully for the first time in hours. "And because I do not like men who lie and call it charity." She tried to parse the sentence for the man behind it, the part that felt like a father, the part that felt like a king, the part that felt like a boy who'd witnessed betrayal. She knew nothing of the secrets that anchored him, only that he had chosen tonight to put himself between the ledger and its architects. It could be an act of vanity, or a rare flash of conscience, or simply a task no one else wanted. In any case, it was an offer, and offers from men like him were tools and chains both. They arrived at the safe house, a small apartment with a narrow balcony and a mattress that looked like it had been slept on by someone who had fled in haste. Lila's hands trembled as she placed the phone on a table and played back the recording. Voices filled the room, low, assured, the kind of language that factored people into numbers. The names came out sharp and cold in playback. Detective Romano laughed in the background. The man in gray's voice was smooth as a well-made wine. The ledger's total hit like a physical blow. As the recording wound on, Lila felt something like control for the first time in 2 years. She could trace this. She could find the money. She could, perhaps, find Karim if his disappearance had anything to do with these channels. Alessandro watched her as she worked, not interfering, and there was a wary respect in that silence. When the playback ended, they both sat in the quiet as if the city had paused too. Lila's mind spun with routes and accounts, with offshore names that could be chased, with auditors who were more comfortable in bribes than in balance sheets. Alessandro's jaw was tight. "Tomorrow," he said simply, "we will start pulling." They had agreed to align against a system that had its teeth in every corner of the city. They had chosen danger over solitude. For a moment, in the fragile warmth of the safe house, the alliance felt like a bridge. But the night had not yet offered mercy. Lila knew, in the marrow of her bones, that alliances with men like Alessandro often required a sacrifice that left a permanent bruise. She also knew that Karim's face, memory sharp in her mind, had been the lever that made her speak in Arabic in the restaurant that night. Outside, rain kept erasing the city's lines. Inside, two people who had been strangers began to build strategies over the cracked table. They would start with accounts, then go to the judge, then to the men who used the city's law, its money and its fear to rewrite truth. It was a plan full of holes and promises and necessary risks. It would also, invariably, make enemies. When Alessandro left her at the door of the safe house and said he would return at dawn with a list of contacts, his goodbye was not warm. His hand brushed hers in a movement that lasted a fraction longer than a touch proper for the moment. The warmth from it lingered like a pledge. Lila closed the door behind him and leaned against the wood, the recorder cold and heavy inside her pocket. The city outside continued its wet breathing. Inside, she allowed herself to imagine, briefly, dangerously, that this was more than a transaction, that it could be a path to something like justice. Her doubts hummed like the recorder. Her fear was a steady drum. The alliance she had made was fragile, taut as a wire. She had placed herself in the hands of a man who measured the world in debts and favors. And yet, for the first time since Kareem vanished, she had a plan that made movement possible. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was small and private and electric. If they were to succeed, they would have to trust one another enough to betray their own instincts. Trust, in a city like this, felt like the first dangerous breath of spring. They did not know yet that the ledger's architects were already aware that someone had noticed. They did not know the ways Detective Romano could bend the law until it snapped like a twig. They did not know that at dawn, a soft, insistent knock would come at the safe house, and the game would shift in a way neither of them could have anticipated. But under the small white lamp, the recorder lay quiet, and Lila clutched it like a talisman, a promise, a threat, a doorway. The knock was polite and slow, like someone asking permission to wake a sleeping household. Lila startled upright and reached for the phone before she remembered the pact. Alessandro would knock once if he was alone, twice if he brought danger. When she opened the door a narrow crack, the hallway light painted the brass number on his chest. He stood there wide-shouldered and damp from rain, but there was another figure behind him, a woman in a cheap gray coat with hair pulled into a tight knot. She smiled at Lila like someone who practiced sympathy in mirrors. 2 knocks. "Alessandro," Lila said, and the syllables had the small, brittle quality of someone who hadn't slept. The man at the door didn't say hello. Instead, he stepped in as if he owned the threshold of other people's lives. "This is Sophia," he said. "She's a lawyer who does favors for people who can't pay market rates. She's careful." Sophia's eyes assessed Lila and slid away, as if cataloging the way fear wore itself on a person. "We don't have time to be careful," she said. Her voice was even, like someone who had learned to hide tremors in her throat. "We have to move fast." Romano knows someone flagged the ledger. He's already reached out to certain people. The lawyer's cadence made the words click into clean danger. If he moves first, evidence disappears. The apartment constricted like a throat closing. Lila felt the recorder against her hip like a heartbeat she could not stifle. "How did he know?" she asked. The question was small but urgent enough to split the air. Sophia looked at Alessandro, then back at Lila. "You were not careful enough in the restaurant," she said bluntly. "You used your voice in Arabic where someone could understand it. Detective Romano has ears everywhere. He has people who gossip for a living." It was a statement with the soft cruelty of truth. They will either seize the ledger or burn the audit trails. We don't have time to pick apart the threads gently. Lila's fingers tightened on the recorder. It felt suddenly like a live wire that might spark and blow them all up. "So what now?" she asked. Alessandro's jaw flexed. "We change the frame," he said. "We force the ledger into light before they can hide it. We make them defend themselves publicly." The plan was simple-sounding but monstrous in its implications. Expose 200 million, force a prosecutor to answer, drag a detective out of the shadows. It would not be subtle. It would name names. It would make enemies of men who measured friendship in silence. Sophia laid out tasks like a surgeon. "You, Lila, will come with me into the prosecutor's office tomorrow. We will seek an injunction to freeze accounts, enough to stop the money from moving. We will need documentation, the recording, the ledger, anything you can trace. Alessandro will provide the muscle for the pressure. If Romano resists, we have to be ready to go public with a judge's order." Lila heard the word muscle like a verdict. "And Kareem?" she whispered. Her question folded into the plan like a plea. Alessandro's expression hardened. "We will look for him once we have the accounts frozen. If his disappearance is connected, the money trail will lead us to people who prefer to keep secrets with deeds, not ledgers. He stepped closer, the smell of rain and limoncello close enough to make her dizzy. But we can't search for ghosts until we know where the bodies are buried. Money buries plenty of things. The next morning came like a raw bruise. The city was washed clean and dishonest under a pale light. Lila sat in a courthouse corridor that smelled of old paper and plaster. Sophia at one side, Alessandro at the other, his presence a constant pressure. The prosecutor they asked for was not the idealized, honest judge Sophia had promised. He was a mid-level man who claimed to hold conscience as an accessory. He liked Alessandro enough to listen and suspiciously enough to temper his curiosity with caution. They presented the recording. They presented the ledger's photographed pages. The prosecutor's fingers trembled as he skimmed names he recognized and knew he should fear. Then the room went still, the kind of silence that is not empty but full of machinery starting. The prosecutor excused himself, promising time to consider an injunction. He left them in the corridor with a soft smile that did not reach his eyes. When he disappeared into the inner rooms, Sophia's jaw set. "We have pieces," she said, "but we are not the only ones with evidence now." That evening, as rain stitched the city's streets into a slick puzzle, a message arrived on Lila's battered phone. A single photograph of Karim's empty apartment, the door open, papers scattered, and a line underneath. "You shouldn't have spoken." The sender was a number she did not know. The heart in her chest knocked against bone. Panic unspooled into fury. "Who sent this?" she demanded, holding the phone like evidence in a trial. Alessandro's face fell a fraction. He took the device, squinted at the message, then crushed his free hand into the space between his brows. "An intimidation," he said, voice thin with something like regret. "They are testing your edges." "The same men who run the ledger?" Lila asked, but it was partly a demand and partly a prayer. Sophia's lips tightened. "It could be for many reasons, but intimidation means they are nervous. Nervous is good sometimes. People move when they get nervous." Yet the photograph did more than rattle nerves. It cracked the fragile trust Lila had begun to let grow. She had imagined, foolishly, that Alessandro would be a straightforward kind of guardian. Threat met with measured response. Instead, she watched him morph into a hunter with decisions she did not control. He orchestrated shadowy moves, sending a lieutenant to watch Karim's building, arranging surveillance through men with old loyalty. He offered protection in ways that felt less like sanctuary and more like containment. He moved like someone whose instinct was to wrap people in invisible chains for their own good. The first fracture came not from betrayal, but from possession. One of Alessandro's aides, Giulio, a man whose loyalty had been bought in small, efficient payments, took it upon himself to enter Karim's apartment while Lila slept. He returned with a small piece of paper folded into a neat square, a receipt that linked Karim to one of the shell companies. Lila's chest leapt with hope for a heartbeat, then snapped. Giulio's possession of the receipt meant something else. Someone had been through Karim's life with intent. Whoever had touched Karim's place could have taken evidence, left clues, or erased traces. "Why didn't you tell me you'd send someone?" Lila demanded, anger burning like a match. "You would have been watched," Alessandro cut in. His voice had the soft steel of a man used to deciding for others. "And we needed speed. We can't be subtle now." "You decided alone," she shot back. "You promised partnership." He flinched as if struck. The word partnership seemed to bruise him, as if the claim of equality was a fragile thing he hadn't learned to hold. "There are things you don't understand," he said, less a rebuke than a tired fact. "There is risk in inviting you into every decision." The argument split them neatly into two positions that, until that moment, had seemed to sit together without friction. She who wanted agency and transparency, and he who measured outcomes in survival and assumed authority as a result. The fracture widened when Julio, eager to show value, produced a second item he claimed to have found in Kareem's trash, a handwritten note with an address and 2 names. One of them bore a surname Lila recognized from the ledger. It should have been relief. Instead, it felt like a trap closing with a soft metallic click. Lila wanted to cry out that they were being funneled into a narrative someone else had made, but the words got stuck on the edge of her throat. Trust, Lila realized, was never simple in a city of men who bent morality into service. She had asked for allies and gotten a protector who could not accept her as equal. Alessandro had offered safety and then undercut it with unilateral moves that left her reeling. The partnership she had imagined was being subsumed into a pattern she had always fled. Decisions made for her, not with her. That night, they argued again, words spoken low and sharp in the safe house's small kitchen. Sophia sat between them like an unwilling priest, hands folded. "You two will break each other," she warned, and there was no judgment, only a practical observation. "If you tear each other apart, the ledger will stay hidden." Alessandro's reply was softer than Lila expected. "I've kept people safe by being what I am. When I change, when I let people decide, I risk everything I built." He looked at her with an almost desperate honesty. "I wanted to help you because you chose something I admired, but I am not good at being something other than myself." Lila's answer was a sob compressed into a sentence. "I didn't come here to be wrapped in your definition of loyalty. I came here to find Kareem. If that requires you to be a different man, tell me now. If not," he finished her thought for her. The silence that followed was a vast, corrosive thing. "If not, then I'll do what I know how to do," he said, "and you will have to trust a man who believes in his own rules." He walked to the window and looked out at a city he could command with a flick of his will. "I'm asking you to accept the cost." Lila felt it then, the scale of the bargain. To work with him was to accept the world as he had shaped it, protection as control. To refuse him was to burn a bridge that might be the only route to the truth. She had come to the city with forged papers and a ledger of grief. She had hoped to keep both in separate pockets. Now, the 2 men who had the power to either save her brother or bury him more thoroughly were standing on opposite sides of the same equation. The night deepened into a cold argument that left both of them raw. In the thin hours, Lila sat alone with the recorder and played back the voices. Romano's laugh, the man in gray's soft plans. The audio was clean and damning and not enough. It could topple a man or buoy one, depending on who controlled the telling. When dawn came, it found them distant and brittle. The shared goal still existed, Kareem's name like a lead weight between them, but the trust that had seemed a fragile bridge had cracked into 2 halves. They had exposed their seams to the light and found that some of the stitches were not meant to hold. The fracture would not heal easily. And somewhere in the city, men who had felt the tremor of being watched were moving their pieces, preparing to strike wherever the balance looked weakest. Lila understood, with a painful clarity, that saving Kareem might require her to break herself in ways she had not anticipated. She also knew that Alessandro's power could be the cleaver that cut through corruption, or the hand that wielded it toward a private justice she might never reconcile. Between them lay a chasm of motives, ghosts, and choices. The next moves would not be about strategy alone. They would be about whether 2 damaged people could bridge a distrust that felt as wide as the sea. The courthouse argument had left wounds that night, but dawn carved a new decision into both of them. They woke to a city that smelled of citrus and wet stone. and the safe house felt like a small vessel tossed on an ocean of men who would not hesitate to sink it. Alessandro arrived at first light with a man who moved like a shadow and 2 dossiers that smelled of cold metal. Surveillance photos of Karim's known haunts, receipts traced to shell accounts, a crooked map of who touched what. Sophia brought a single improbable thing: a judge's private number, passed through an old favor held in a bakery that owed Alessandro a debt. The list of allies was shamefully thin. The enemy was everywhere. They made their plan under hushed light, voices like knives. Sophia would go into the prosecutor's office and keep pressure with the injunction. Alessandro's lieutenants would freeze movement in the bank corridors where the shell accounts lived. Lila would do the painstaking work she knew: follow the numbers, read the small ghosts within spreadsheets, connect receipts and invoices to people who preferred other people's ignorance. It was the kind of work that required patience and a brutal curiosity. It was also work that would force her into rooms where her past and present met like 2 knives. They moved the map inward. Alessandro's men moved through the city with practiced calm. Banks froze transfers on paper before the men who managed them knew what had happened. Sophia leaned like a stone against the prosecutor's office, bringing the judge's name into the conversation at the exact moment the prosecutor found his courage endangered by the smell of scandal. The ledger's edges began to fray. It should have been a surgical triumph. Instead, it became a war of nerves. Detective Romano, personified threat, retaliated with a cruelty that proved he was not a footnote but an architect. He called in favors: a sudden audit, a whisper to a judge who leaned the other way, a midnight visit to a clerk who suddenly remembered paperwork that never existed. The authorities began to sputter like an old engine forced to accelerate. Evidence that had seemed safe in the light of dawn lurched back toward shadow. Someone at the bank pulled a file. A name vanished from a database. Giulio's triumphant receipt became a question mark. Panic, which had once been a private ache in Lila's chest, burned outward. The authorities turned to the thing he knew best: decisive movement. He called in a favor that lived in the bones of the city. Not violence at first, but a pressure campaign of public eyes. A friend in a local paper, a journalist who owed Alessandro for a kindness years back, was persuaded to publish an innocuous story about a charity's suspicious donations. The piece was small and careful, barely a whisper of accusation, but it sent the ledger's architects into a frenzy. They had counted on silence. Now the spotlight dulled. That night, when they finally had a hit, a banker with shaking hands who admitted to moving funds on a schematic, it came with a price. The banker's confession led to an address: a warehouse on the outskirts where files were stored and men went when they wanted to make dirt disappear. The choice was immediate. Sophia argued for a warrant and a legal sweep. Alessandro wanted to send people in and retrieve what the law might never recover if they waited. Lila saw both roads and knew the ledger's architects had friends in law enforcement who could nullify a warrant if given time. She also knew that a forcible entry would make enemies with men whose retribution would not be measured in paper alone. In the end, they did both. Sophia blitzed the courthouse with emotion and a strongly worded affidavit. Alessandro sent a small team, precise and trained, to circle the warehouse under cover of night. Lila demanded to go with them, not out of bravado, but because every time she was kept at arm's length, the plan bent toward possession. Alessandro argued, then finally he relented. He did not tell her she was in danger as a favor. He placed a pistol in her hand and looked at her as if deciding whether she was capable of firing it. The gesture felt like an unasked-for admission that he trusted her enough to make the choice. They moved at midnight. The warehouse sat squat against the sky, an animal breathing dust and secrecy. The team split. Sophia's legal paper would arrive in the morning. Alessandro's men would take what they could now. Lila walked beside him through gravel and shadow. The city's lights were distant like restless stars. For a few moments, there was nothing but 2 quick breaths and the soft clack of their boots. Inside, the building smelled of old paper and coffee gone cold. Men stirred, thinking sleep would protect the ledger. It did not. The team worked like surgeons, quick, silent, efficient. They found locked cabinets, then a metal trunk wired into a false floor. Inside were ledger copies, burner phones, a list of shell companies, and payments bright as a map. Lila felt her hands shake, not from fear, but from the precise, terrible hope that surged. This was not just a ledger. It was a map to the people who had taken Kareem's life. Names glowed like locusts. Romano's men arrived sooner than anticipated, a clumsy ballet of lights and boots, and the night turned combustible. Alessandro's team moved to protect the hall. A shove, a shouted warning. Fire tasted like compressed air. Lila found herself in the middle of a scuffle, the pistol heavy in her hand, the decision she had not wanted, now absolute. A silhouette lunged at the trunk. Giulio intercepted and stumbled backward into a fall that cracked his skull on a metal crate. The warehouse became a cartography of fear, lights, yells, metal. In the chaos, a hand closed around Lila's wrist and pulled her down as a bolt flew by the space where her head had been. It was Alessandro, his face a mask of concentration and something else, relief that she was not the body on the floor. They fought back the raid with a fury that felt ancient and unjust. When the dust settled and the law, now finally in public view, swept in with arms and paper, Lila sat on a crate and cried like a woman who had been holding her breath for years and had finally let it go. Giulio was alive, blood slicking his temple, but the documents were safe. The men who had come from Romano's world were hauled out in cuffs, sputtering about rights and misreadings. The prosecutor, backed by the judge's pressure and the public story, had no choice but to seize the ledgers and call for immediate freezes. As the warehouse emptied into police vans and fluorescent lights, Alessandro found her in the chaos. He crouched and touched her face like a midwife checking for a pulse. She smelled of dust and adrenaline and something wholly private, the perfume of having survived. His fingers were cool and determined. "You could have died," he said, not as reproach, but as fact. His voice trembled in a way Lila had not expected, not with weakness, but with an honest fear that pulled at her like a tide. "I had to be there," she replied. Her voice was a little raw, but steady. "If you had taken everything without me, I would have lost Kareem twice." He looked at her then, the streetlight painting lines on his face. He could have offered platitudes. Instead, he did something simpler and more dangerous for a man of his habits. He reached out and kissed her. It was not tender in the way a lover might kiss a lover, not that night, but it was an offering, a sharp, sacred thing, an apology, a claim, a pact sealed with breath. Lila's first instinct was to push him away. The second, the truthful one, was to let herself fall into the press of the moment. She answered him, not with lust, but with the fervor of two people who had nearly been crushed, and had chosen, in the chaos, to hold to one another. When they broke apart, the rain began anew, soft and forgiving. The evidence recovered in the warehouse forced a cascade. Accounts frozen, arrests made, a prosecutor publicly embarrassed into action. Detective Romano's name was whispered like a curse. His power, once a vast shadow, shrank as men aligned to survive threatened to claw their way free. The city's machine turned, reluctant and grinding, but turning nonetheless. They did not find Kareem that night. What they found were threads that might lead to his place. A list of transfers to a small coastal holding company with ties to men known for shipping things the law preferred not to catalog. It was not closure, it was direction. In the days that followed, Lila and Alessandro moved through a shared orbit. Late-night planning, quiet moments where they bared pieces of themselves, and fractures that reopened and then healed differently because both now knew what the other had seen in the dark. He taught her how to wield authority without erasing voice. She taught him how to listen without deciding. The sacrifice had been Alessandro's too. He had chosen to expose his network rather than bury scandal to preserve his pride. It cost him alliances and men who had counted on his silence. For Lila, the sacrifice was different. She surrendered anonymity and the small protective lie of being unseen. She became visible and, with that visibility, vulnerable. The ledger's unraveling would be long and bloody. Trust would need to be rebuilt in small, stubborn acts. But in the week after the warehouse, Lila found that when Alessandro touched her, now there was less proprietorship and more plea. The city had not forgiven them. Men who trafficked in fear had not yet learned humility. But beneath the ruin of their old lives, something new had taken root. The dangerous, fragile understanding that saving someone sometimes meant letting them into the fire and then refusing to let them burn alone. They stood once on the water's edge where the city breathed into the sea. Alessandro's hand found hers in the dark, calloused and sure. "We will find him," he said simply. Lila tightened her grip. She did not believe in promises easily. But she believed in the ledger, in the proof they had taken from the dark, and in the man who had chosen to make himself less of a sovereign and more of an ally. "Then we will," she answered. The sea smoothed the lights into a ribbon of possibility. The fight was not over, but for the first time since Kareem's disappearance, Lila felt the shape of hope as a thing that might be fought for and won. Dawn came softer now, a patient light that mapped the city in honest lines. The arrests had loosened some threads. The judge had frozen accounts. The prosecutor had spoken words that flattered like loose change. None of it stitched the gap where Kareem should have been, but the map had new marks. Addresses, small boats with false manifests, a name repeated in 3 different ledgers. Salvatore Rizzo. Whenever Lila saw that name, she felt the bruise of hope and the burn of fear in equal measure. They settled into a rhythm that was neither easy nor entirely violent. Morning triage of leads, afternoons tracing transfers in a cramped office Sophia had borrowed from a cousin, nights on the phone with reluctant witnesses. Alessandro began to bring her small, practical things she'd never expected to need. An unlocked desk at his warehouse, a burner phone with stronger reception, a jacket thick enough for stakeouts. He never asked where she slept now. The offer of a spare room was implied and unspoken. She accepted the tools and declined the space, keeping the frayed independence that had kept her alive. Still, his presence shifted from dominion to something softer, an arm extended that did not yank or tether but steadied. They learned one another's languages of survival. Layla taught Alessandro to read spreadsheets like confessions. He taught her how to hold a cigarette without letting it betray her nerves. They debated strategy until dawn spilled in and the city yawned open. They fractured sometimes. Old habits curved like cracks in porcelain, but they always came back to the ledger and to the same stubborn human thing between them, the search for a boy's face. The clue that finally moved them was small and ugly, a receipt for a ferry booked under a false name, stamped at a port 2 hours' drive down the coast. It was the kind of breadcrumb Kareem might have followed in his impulse to help someone out of a scrape. They drove in separate cars at dusk, Layla steady in the passenger seat of Alessandro's older sedan, the radio between them playing a station that smelled like the sea. When they reached the port, the air tasted of iron and salt, and the world narrowed to footsteps and a dozen low, anxious lights. The berth they found was empty of men but full of quiet. A small dinghy bobbed loose, its hull scraped and honest. Inside, folded in a jacket that smelled like cigarettes and olive oil, Lila found a photograph, worn at the edges, of Kareem smiling, younger and stubborn, his arm around a boy with a missing front tooth. On the back was a scrawled line, "For when they ask what we owed them." She folded the photograph to her chest and let the city's breath fill her. Alessandro stood close behind, not touching but present like a promise. "We'll follow this," he said, and his voice had the same soft iron it always carried. All the way. They did follow it. Weeks became a tangle of small triumphs and cruel retreats. A man who knew too much turning up dead in another province. A ledger page surfacing in a lawyer's desk. A phone call that led to a warehouse with a name carved into its frame. They found traces of Kareem, shoes, a receipt, a woman who swore she had seen him at a market, but never the final, clean line that would turn grief into reunion. Each near miss widened the ache and tightened their resolve. Yet something else shifted under the strain. Where once Alessandro's protection felt like a cage, it softened into partnership. He asked fewer questions about how she did her work and more about what she felt when she did it. Lila stopped bracing at his every plan and began to speak up before plans were made. They made mistakes, moves that risked exposure and small cruelties of control, but they apologized in ways that began to feel like repair. He kissed her in a hospital stairwell once, after a witness named names and then recanted. It was quick and shaky, more an anchor than desire. She kissed him back because she wanted to be held by someone who would not look away. One evening, months from the first night in the restaurant, they sat on the roof of Alessandro's building watching the city fold into night. The lights threaded like an old map. The sea was a dark promise. He passed her a glass of cheap wine and, for the first time, spoke of a future that wasn't just a ledger or a loss. "If we find him," he said quietly, "we will not go back to how things were. I don't want to be the man who decides for others." Lila's laugh came out like a small, surprised sound. "I don't want to be invisible anymore," she replied. "I don't want to live in the margins of your decisions." He reached for her hand, and this time did not squeeze it like ownership. He laid it flat, his fingers warming the outside of hers. "Then we walk forward together," he promised. "Not safe, not neat, but together." They watched the city breathe. Somewhere beyond the glow, men still made fortunes and buried people. The law still bent where it fancied. The ledger's unraveling would take more lives than they had and might never give them everything they sought. But in the small, luminous theater of that roof, wine staining the rim of their glasses, the salt wind tangling Lila's hair, they let themselves imagine something different. A life where grief and power met and did not always consume one another. Lila slid the worn photograph from her pocket and unfolded it, smoothing the edges with a thumb that had once polished silverware. She held it up against the skyline, letting Kareem's smile face the city he had vanished into. Alessandro leaned his head against hers, and the two of them watched the lights, each one a story waiting to be rescued or forgiven. The sound of the sea was steady and large, an insistence that the world moved on no matter what they carried. They sat there, a mafia boss who had chosen to make himself vulnerable and a young woman who had traded anonymity for truth. And for the first time since the night she spoke a single Arabic sentence that changed everything, Lila felt something like safety, not because a man held power over her, but because she shared that power with someone willing to be changed by it. It was not a neat ending. It never would be. But as the moon carved a silver path across the water, she tucked the photograph back into her pocket and let the night hold them. Two people learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to keep one another from falling.